I'm Peter Levine, the director of the Defense Management Institute, and we're here today as a part of a series of interviews of individuals who have made significant contributions to improving the management of the Department of Defense. Today, I'm speaking with Robert Shea, who has been working to improve government management for more than 25 years, most prominently by serving as Associate Director of the Office of Management and Budget, responsible for performance management and related issues. Previously, Mr. Shea handled government management issues for both the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs and the House Committee on Government Reform. After completing his government career, Mr. Shea handled the public policy portfolio for Grant Thornton and then moved to Gov Navigators, where he is currently the CEO. Mr. Shea has also served as chairman of the board of directors of the National Academy of Public Administration. Mr. Shea, welcome, and we're glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
So I like to start all these interviews by asking people how they first came to work for the government. I believe you started your career on Capitol Hill, but I'm not sure. Can you tell me how that came about?
So I married a girl from Connecticut, brought her to Houston where I was attending law school, and my graduating from law school and securing a law license coincided with the Republicans taking control of the House and Senate for the first time in 40 years. And so that combined with my wife wanting to get out of Houston landed me here in D.C., where I wanted more than anything to be a part of this revolution in Congress. And so I landed a temporary, then permanent job in the committee on the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. And that began a long love of tinkering, either lightly or heavily, in the operations of the federal government.
During your career on Capitol Hill, I believe you worked on both personal staff and committee staff, and you worked on for both the House and the Senate. Let me just ask, differences between working on personal staff and committee staff, how would you characterize that?
Well, on the committee staff does have a greater degree of professionalism associated with it, and with the personal staff, you're basically working at the whim of an individual. The chairman of a committee certainly dictates what you're going to work on, but it's a little bit more democratic, at least. And the pace of working for an individual is greater. So you're generally working 24/7 for that individual.
A shorter term focus?
Much shorter term focus, because you are positioning that individual not only to contribute to whatever policy priorities they have, but to their reelection, of course.
Mm-hmm. And do you see significant differences? Did you see significant differences between working for the House and working for the Senate?
Yeah, I remember. I kind of think of my career as going upwards on the ladder, which, my House colleagues would be completely offended by.
As a longtime Senate staffer, I'm all with you on this one.
But I remember landing in the Senate Government Affairs Committee with grand ideas about what we would do rapidly. And my colleagues just sort of patted me on the head and said, calm down, this is not the House of Representatives. We take a more measured approach here. So pace of memos, pace of ideas, pace of activities slowed somewhat, but I was blessed to have a member who really cared about the portfolio I covered and also had a very high profile. So those ingredients really sort of helped me have a bigger impact.
This would be Senator Collins.
Senator Thompson.
Oh, Senator Thompson.
Senator Fred Thompson was then chairman.
I got the timing wrong, yeah.
Yeah, and he was a movie star, but really cared about stuff that other members, as you know, might find a little boring.
Yeah. Can you talk about the relationship between staff and member? Focus on committee staff, but in terms, I think that people out there, not only in the public as a whole, but people in the department don't understand the role that the staff play and how that relates to members' roles in the enactment of legislation. Some may overinflate the importance of staff and the influence of staff, but how would you describe the relationship between staff and members in terms of establishing priorities and getting things done?
Yeah, so the jurisdiction of a committee is divided among its staff. You have a portfolio of issues that you're obligated to cover, and you're the expert. The member, the chair, has to possess at least a cursory knowledge of all of the issues under the jurisdiction of the committee. They have staff that are required to have deeper expertise. But there is definitely a give and take. And with Senator Thompson, for instance, he would get a stream of ideas about what to pursue. And if you were lucky enough, he would want to dig deeper, either legislatively or from an oversight perspective on a specific issue. Improper payments was an example where GAO had uncovered a significant amount of improper payments. And so the chairman put out a statement, and we began a long series of legislative efforts to try and get a handle on increasing waste in government. Does that get it?
Oh, absolutely. So you actually worked on improper payments, I believe, both in the legislative branch and then subsequently in the executive branch, if I've got that right. So this is an issue to which you were committed for a long time.
That's right. That's right. And it's only gotten worse. I don't know that I'm the.
So you're going to take that as a success. Can you talk about what improper payments are and what leads to improper payments?
So an improper payment is defined as a payment made to an individual or an organization either in the wrong amount or to the wrong individual or organization. And it can be an underpayment or an overpayment. But generally we're concerned about programs that make extensive amount and numbers of payments to the wrong people or in excess of what those
and we see numbers in the billions of dollars for
hundreds of billions of dollars. The Government Accountability Office recently estimated the extent of fraud in the federal government somewhere between $250 to $500 billion annually. There's a lot of controversy about that number and the methodology they used, but suffice it to say, we have not gotten a handle on the extent of fraud and improper payments in the government.
And one of the things that makes it worse, you said it may be higher today than it has, but one of the things that makes it worse is when we have disasters or special programs in response to disasters or economic recovery programs, things where we're putting out a lot of money in a short period of time. Is that fair?
Fair. It need not be so, because technology has evolved to such a degree that we shouldn't have to balance speed with accuracy. We have tools at our disposal now that if government only used them correctly, we could prevent an incredible amount of waste.
So can you talk about the kinds of steps that you tried to take both legislatively and then later at OMB to address the problem?
Sure. The two things I want to emphasize is the relationship between congressional staff and the Government Accountability Office. GAO has an extremely important role to play in advising Congress on what to do when it identifies a problem. And so they recommended regular reporting by a broad swath of agencies and programs on the estimates of improper payments and then what controls they'll have in place and to what extent it's working. In retrospect, I think that took too wide a brush at too many programs instead of focusing on those that really are at the highest risk. You know, the big mandatory programs like Medicare, Medicaid, or the Earned Income Tax Credit. Those are programs that really, if you focused your energies on those, you'd stem a significant percentage of the overall improper payments. The other side of the coin is, you know, when you're in a central agency like the Office of Management and Budget, you know, you can plow through based on your authority, but you're not going to have nearly as much success if you do it collaboratively with agencies. So I got to work with every major agency in the federal government, negotiating on just what approach we were going to take, what estimating methodologies you were going to use, how you were going to report these things, sharing information on what controls worked best or what didn't. So, you know, that's the lesson I quickly had to learn when I joined OMB.
So we'll get to OMB a little later. I don't want to leave Congress quite yet. I want to ask you about sort of Congress's role in management, which is a tough one because Congress isn't a managing agency; it's a legislating or a managing body. It's a legislating body. We've had a series of overarching statutes passed over the last several decades, since basically across the time that you and I have been in government, that have tried to deal with government management on sort of an encompassing or umbrella basis. I jotted down a quick list, but it's not comprehensive. The CFO Act, the Klinger-Cohen Act, GIPRA, GIPRAMA, FMFIA, FFMIA. There are many others. I think you, like me, don't have a particular ownership interest in those. I could be wrong, but do you have a view as to whether the statutory frameworks that we've tried to impose on government management have made a difference? Is government management better today than it was, say, when Ronald Reagan was president, before you and I came into this business?
Yes, and I say that largely as a consequence of having to sleep at night. I do think that over time, our attention to important systemic management challenges has matured. We're better financially managed. Human capital is a bigger priority and therefore gets a lot of attention in management. Same with IT and acquisition. We've done both too little and too much in all of those arenas. Lots of requirements, because every law produces policy, regulation, the volumes of which are hard to measure. And so a lot of effort focused on compliance that may divert resources from, really critical issues. But I think on the whole, I would have to say each of those major management challenges has improved to some degree as a result of these efforts.
One way that I look at it is that we can look at it in terms of management systems, and you can look at it in terms of managers. And I think our management systems are probably better. Certainly our IT and our data are better and more effective. I think that there's a good case to be made that our processes are more regularized across government than they were. But at the end of the day, management still comes down to managers. And I don't have any particular reason to believe that we have better managers in government today than we did 40 years ago. Is that fair or unfair?
I don't have the data to say whether or not today's managers are better than yesterday's. I do have an abiding confidence that leadership is a critical ingredient to success of any endeavor, including addressing major management challenges. A lot of the leaders we attract in government are drawn not by wanting to roll up your sleeves and get it to the back office functions of agencies, but more the sexy policy issues. And the more and more we can attract people who are dedicated to improving the operations of the government, the better off we're going to be. So I think I'm agreeing with you that it's just hard to find people with both the interest and the acumen to focus on these relatively boring management issues.
Yeah. Do you have a view on the mix of political leadership and career officials in dealing with management problems, how they relate, and what respective roles they need to play?
Yeah. I have a lot of folks that I engage with who think we've got too many political appointees. And I disagree. It's in the thousands, and you've got a federal workforce in the millions. So you need, to some degree, a force to implement the president's program when he or she is elected. The greater attention should be paid to ensuring that the political appointees are qualified for the positions to which they're appointed. The same is true of career officials. Critical is a collaboration between political and career. Woe be the political who thinks that he or she can get something done without close collaboration with the careers. But also it's incumbent on the careers to serve political appointees and or those appointed by the president to deliver on his mission.
After working on the Hill, so I'm changing over now. I told you I was going to do that. You moved to OMB. Can you start with just explaining how that move came about? How does one move from congressional staff to a senior position in the executive branch?
So I worked on the George W. Bush campaign. Come from Houston, big Bush fans for generations. And then I worked on the transition, and worked in particular on molding the management priorities during the campaign. And I remember watching a speech the president gave from the delivery room at Alexandria Hospital, where my wife was delivering our middle child, watching the then candidate Bush give a speech that I helped write that talked about a lot of the management priorities. And then, as you know, I was working on the committee that confirmed a lot of these officials who were landing at OMB. So as I got to know them, I was shameless in saying, by the way, if you have a slot for me over there, I'd be delighted. Yeah. So I did. I landed in the Office of Federal Financial Management, as you mentioned, working on improper payments, working for then Controller Mark Everson. He got promoted to be the Deputy Director for Management, which oversees the management improvement efforts across the executive branch. And that began about a 7.5 year time at OMB.
So first question about coming into the executive branch. What did you learn in the executive branch that you wished you had known when you were still on the Hill?
That they're human beings, that there's not an invisible force preventing you from crossing the wide divide between the executive branch and the legislative branch. I learned at OMB that the most productive path to collaboration with the legislative branch was not through the Legislative Affairs Office at OMB. Those are people whose middle name is No. And you're talking about people with whom I had deep relationships on a bipartisan basis. And so if to put barriers up between the productivity you could gain with those relationships is just it disadvantages the president. And so does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, yeah. That's great. When people think about OMB, most of them think about the budget function. That there's this saying that the M in OMB is silent. I'm sure you've heard that. Yeah. Can you talk about how much ability OMB has to influence management on a government-wide basis? How much of a role does it play, and how effective is it?
So we had two tools that we constructed early in the days of the Bush administration. One was the Executive Branch Management Scorecard. We articulated the standards we were going to use to judge each agency's maturity in each of these areas.
Is that the same as the PART tool?
Nope.
Or is it? No? Okay.
It's the second tool.
Okay.
Don't get ahead of me.
Oh, sorry.
So we met every quarter with the budget divisions, their resource management offices, and they're not exclusively budget, but in our case, we charged them with working with the agencies to gather the evidence and come up with not only a grade but an improvement plan in each of these areas. So we worked explicitly through the budget divisions.
So with DOD, for example, that would be through the comptroller?
No.
Okay.
In OMB, the RMO, the Resource Management Office.
You work through your budget people at OMB to reach the agency.
That's right. Okay. So the National Security Division would meet regularly with DOD officials to ascertain where they were on the scorecard.
Okay.
And we then met with each OMB division quarterly to discuss where they are and what we need to improve. This was transparent, but this close collaboration with the budget divisions meant that not only did we remove any barrier between the two, but we also increased the resources devoted to management improvement exponentially. If you keep those two divided, then you're really handicapped. You mentioned the PART. This is another tool we had called the Program Assessment Rating Tool. And we had a group of career civil servants drawn from the budget divisions to help administer this. We assessed every single program in the government and with an eye towards improving its performance and efficiency.
So the first one is a functional assessment, is that right? And the second one is a program assessment?
That's
is that
exactly right. That's exactly right.
How does a balanced scorecard fit into that?
Well, I guess if you squish them together, you would get what resembled a balanced scorecard.
Okay.
But the executive branch management scorecard focused on key back office functions: HR, IT, acquisition, financial management, and performance.
Got it. Okay.
And then the program assessment rating tool really, it basically was comprised of an inventory of all the government's programs and a body of evidence that told you which ones worked, which one didn't. So you could focus on eliminating them if they didn't work, improving them, reinvesting money from those that didn't work to those that did. Now, this is all very theoretically and very hard to actually administer, but that was the theory.
So are there success stories that you can, I know I'm pushing you back a long time into your history, but are there success stories out of that you can talk about, that where you felt that you had managed, you had achieved something, so that not only had you instituted the tools, but here's something we were able to accomplish through this?
Sure. I mean, there are lots of examples. One of the easiest to communicate is that before Bush was elected, agencies were obligated to produce audited financial statements 6 months after the end of the fiscal year. We accelerated that to 45 days, and heads exploded all over the financial management community. That's impossible. But within about a year and a half or 2 years, all but one or two agencies, Department of Defense among them, was able to get clean opinions on their financial statements within that period of time. And the theory was, if you gave agencies so much time to produce these financial statements, they were doing it manually. They weren't using systems to produce the statements. They were cobbling them together using heroic efforts. So this sort of was intended to break that.
So beyond that, if you're using heroic efforts, then that means, and the data is available 6 months later, that means the data isn't available in real time to help you manage your programs. So it's not actually useful data in the same way.
Exactly. Now, with respect to the program assessment rating tool, one of the questions we asked is, to what extent has your program been rigorously evaluated? And does that evidence show your program to be effective or not? It revealed a paucity of such evidence. And so we began to require more rigorous evaluations. One program I recall, the Nurse Home Visitation Program, pilots, a significant number of pilots, all of them rigorously evaluated, showed real improvement in the quality of life and health of those born into underprivileged families. So we got to scale up that program as a result of this evidence, but it also launched a drive for greater evidence-based policymaking. So the governance around that has ballooned, and per our earlier conversation, we may have gone overboard as to the compliance requirements and bells and whistles around that, but you do see a significant amount of evidence about programs that you wouldn't have otherwise had if we hadn't started asking that question during that time.
So we've also seen a proliferation of dashboards and a belief in dashboards, I think, and I'd like to get your take on when dashboards are useful and how they have to be used to be effective. That's something you could...
Yeah. So my one individual leader I've observed very closely, both in his time as mayor, governor, and now agency head, is Martin O'Malley. He employed CompStat, New York City's criminal justice improvement efforts, to the operations, first when he was mayor of Baltimore, then as governor of Maryland, and now as commissioner at Social Security Administration. He uses data and maps, regular cadence of meetings, incredible transparency. He's got 4 meetings every other week and invites the Hill, invites OMB, sometimes external stakeholders, has all of his leadership in a room viewing the same amount of data, same source of data, and makes decisions in real time. You know, those are dashboards, but they evolve. They're not static, and you follow the data where it leads you. Now, he's early days at Social Security Administration while we're sitting here today, but he's made tremendous strides in a short period of time using this methodology. So it's not just dashboards. Just posting a dashboard does not drive people. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, the quality of the leadership is a significant ingredient in whether or not it's going to be successful, no matter what you're talking.
So I would have said that data without insight is not going to be helpful for management, that you need to go beyond just having data and understand what your data is telling you and why it's telling you something. And if you don't have that understanding, then the dashboard may hurt as much as it helps.
Oh, that's absolutely right. If you're continuing to stare at the problem like your navel, you're not going to move the ball. But what, to your point, Commissioner O'Malley has all the leadership in the room. And so if somebody's saying, this is a problem that's unsolvable, you'll have someone else in the room who say, no, it's not. I know exactly how to solve that problem. It's not usually that clear, but you have each other holding yourself accountable for the truth and what might solve the problem.
Or if this number went down and that looks like it's not a good thing, presumably you have the person in the room who can tell you why the number went down, so you can evaluate, so you can determine whether this is something whether you need to immediately address, or whether maybe it's not significant that it went down, even though it looks bad. There's a rational explanation. We can expect to go back up next month or whatever it is.
And then, but you've also got a map. If you plot all this on a map, you can see everybody's kind of middling. Somebody's really in the ditch, but you've got an outlier, a higher performer. Let's go and figure out what is going on there. He's got an incredible story about how he had an outlying office that showed processing times greater than any others. So they went and asked what the deal was, and it turns out the leader there offered everybody a half day off every other Friday if they met their targets. And so the commissioner said, why don't we roll that out to every office? And of course the HR people said, well, we're not allowed to do that, Commissioner. And so not only did they not roll it out, but they had to stop it at this office. That's the kind of whack-a-mole you play sometimes in government management.
Another issue, sort of a generic issue that I'd like to ask you about is at the Department of Defense in particular, we go through these, what they're called efficiencies drills from time to time. And an efficiency drill is an effort to save money because we're running into budget issues, and save money through management. And the idea is we'll figure out how we can, the theory is there's management waste, so we'll manage better and we'll save money. The reality may be that we're going to cut things in management and it may or may not be less effective. Do you have a view as to the relationship between budget cutting and management improvements?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think doing something for efficiency's sake is necessarily going to have the kind of systemic improvement that you want. You know, you could break your pick trying to reduce the number of musicians on the payroll at the Department of Defense, but that won't necessarily make the culture any better. and won't really save that significant amount of money. You really should focus on high risk, high reward type activity.
If you want to improve your systems, you probably have to invest money in the short term rather than cutting money in the short term.
Right, that's right. I mean, if you look at fraud, it's going to take you some money to invest in the controls to stem it. But the long-term reward is going to be significant. And that's you have to have that conversation with Congress. They have to make those long-term or those short-term investments to get those long-term.
Yeah. You mentioned that the Department of Defense is an outlier on the defense on the audit. We're 30 plus years after the enactment of the CFO audit. Every agency in the federal government, every major agency in the federal government has a clean audit now, I believe, except the Department of Defense. You served in OMB, not in DOD, but do you have views on that as to why that's the case? Is it realistic to think that we're going to get to a DOD audit in the short term? What's your take on this issue?
Yeah, I'm not sure when we'll get there, but I believe we'll get there. I worked for a independent public accounting firm that was working on the financial statement audit at the Department of Defense. And you got to be careful that some of those entities want it so bad they're willing to take shortcuts to get there. I mean, what you're really looking for is sound financial management that allows you to track that the money is going to the right place, that it's producing the kind of lethality that the department is looking for. There are so many variables driving where the money goes at the Department of Defense. You don't want it to be diverted by poor financial management. So, but we've had variability in the priority that leaders at DoD have put on this. I think we're at a fairly sustained moment now from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And so long as that attention is sustained, reasonable resources are devoted to it, then I think we will make significant improvement.
You also, if I understand it right, you played a role in the effort to establish new personnel systems, I believe, in the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security. Well, I was there too for that. Can you describe what the objective was behind the effort?
So when we were creating the Department of Homeland Security, we saw it as an opportunity to start fresh in a lot of arenas, and one of them was personnel. So we wanted to introduce a lot of flexibility for that department when it was created. Secretary Rumsfeld, then Deputy Secretary England, were a little jealous, it would seem, of that. And so they took it as an opportunity to propose similar flexibilities for civilian personnel at the Department of Defense. The government's personnel system doesn't serve it well. It is difficult to recruit and retain talent to perform. The public sector doesn't get the same level of pay as they would get if they were working in the private sector. So you're already handicapped from that perspective. But putting up hurdles in the hiring process, making it difficult to hold poor performers accountable, doesn't help you. So there's a long-standing desire to break free from those shackles and do a better job recruiting and retaining and rewarding high performers.
The NSPS and the DHS personnel systems were intended essentially to break free of the entirety of the civil service system in many ways. I mean, there were some aspects that were retained, and certainly pension systems, things like that were retained. But I personally was always more in favor of targeted reform, where you could say, this is my problem and I want to address it. There are reasons why the administration wanted a broader approach, but I wonder whether you could identify the 2 or 3 things that you would change in the existing civilian personnel system if you had the chance to do that. So what would you do if you could target something as specific areas where we could write a new system?
I think in hiring, that would be a critical one, to simplify the hiring process, to limit the favoritism that is built into the system, because you really want to produce the highest quality candidate. And if you show favoritism to one population over another, it diminishes the quality of the candidates you can consider. I would limit the avenues of appeal individuals have when they're being disciplined for either poor performance or bad behavior, so that you can fire those individuals more easily. The most common feedback you get as the result of the annual Federal Employee Viewpoint survey of federal employees, is that organizations don't adequately hold poor performers accountable. So that's the second thing. And the third thing has got to be pay or culture. You've got to produce an environment that makes it more likely that individuals are going to stay in their jobs. We're competing with the private sector for talent. Technology is evolving at such a speed that you really do want to, if we, by the grace of God, hire somebody who's able to leverage these tools, and they find themselves in an environment where they can't really use them to the best advantage, they're going to go to an organization where they can. So you really do need to change the culture and the environment in which they're operating.
I have this distinction that I make between pay for performance and pay for market-based pay and performance-based pay. What we have gone to with NSPS and the DHS system and with the various demonstration programs that we have in the Department of Defense, which are still running today, is a performance-based pay system, which has had problems, or certainly had problems at least with NSPS when it was up, in that the government's ability to manage performance-based pay and be perceived as being fair in how it distributes pay seems to have been a major stumbling block. I can't tell you how fair or unfair it was, but the view that it was unfair seemed to have been pervasive. I could explain that in fairly simple terms as why that might be the case. Anybody who's paid higher, who benefits from the system, assumes it's because, of course, they get paid better because they deserve it. Anybody who gets paid less blames it on the system. So nobody's going to credit the system for doing better. They're going to credit themselves for doing better, but they're going to blame the system for doing worse. Regardless of that, it seemed to be a big stumbling block in the system. The concern that you expressed about the government's ability to attract might be addressed by market-based pay as opposed to by performance-based pay. So you could pay people not by what did you contribute this year and how am I going to compare you against your peers in terms of what they contributed, but by you're a software engineer and I need to pay my software engineers a lot better than I'm paying them. It might be a simpler and more acceptable change to make. I wonder if you thought about the difference between market-based pay and performance-based pay and have any views on that.
I haven't thought about it until now. You get in your bubble and you think that you've got to play within the existing rules. The key word you used was simpler. So I think the proposal that Don Rumsfeld and Gordon England came up with was probably elegant. But then it's got to get through the hill, and then it's got to get implemented by regulation. And all of that adds such complexity that the gears sort of get locked. Yeah. And we really do have to take either performance-based pay or market-based pay. Both have risks of complexity. You got to make sure that it's simple so that people understand it, can justify it, and that it remains transparently implemented.
Let me ask you one last question about your time at OMB. OMB has at times had a strained relationship with the Department of Defense, in particular. I would guess from the OMB perspective, DoD doesn't like to play, and they got enough political chips that they don't have to sometimes. From the DoD perspective, we got enough problem managing our own business without having these outsiders trying to step in and do it for us. Do you have views as to that relationship between OMB and DoD? How functional was it when you were there? Are there thoughts that you have as to how it could be better?
So I assume I haven't told you this story, but my last boss at OMB was then Director Jim Nussel, and he underwent a reorganization or a review of the operations of OMB. OMB is very small, and FTEs are precious. And my proposal at the time, half joking, was to eliminate the National Security Division because it had the most people of any part of OMB. But DoD ignored everything it said. So why not reallocate those to those divisions that really have a more constructive relationship with the agencies they oversee? Now, it didn't happen, and I think there are constructive things going on in that relationship. But DoD is so good at the game. They have such a close relationship with the president and those close to the president. And if they don't, they'll find people with whom to nurture the right relationship to get their way. One of the people I worked most closely with at OMB was the president's best friend. I'll never forget the day I went working from Mark Everson to Clay Johnson, Clay being the president's best friend. My stock went way up. I was suddenly the focus of much greater attention from across the executive branch as a result of my close relationship with him. So those who know how to navigate the politics, small p politics of administrations are going to get ahead, and DoD is as good at that as any organization in the world.
Clay Johnson was also very good at negotiating those.
Yes,
politics.
absolutely.
After you left OMB, you went to work for Grant Thomas. Was that
Grant Thornton?
Grant Thornton. I'm sorry. That was your next step.
That's right.
Can you describe what consulting, the role that consulting firms play in improving government management?
Sure. It's a sad fact, to your point about market-based pay, that consulting firms can attract better talent than the government. So the government often supplements its workforce with a contracting workforce in whatever endeavor they're working on. Grant Thornton, in addition to being an independent public accounting firm, had a strategic consulting arm. And so we had, financial management, strategic planning, performance management, information technology consulting. So whatever management improvement effort an agency was undertaking, they often put out requests for proposals to support those. And so we would bid to help. And so we were working side by side with leadership in agencies to achieve whatever their management improvement goal.
So was it the general rule that you would be then embedded with the government team, or you'd be separate and sort of retain your own core and provide them arm's length advice?
You can have both, but we were more the latter, brought in to do support a discrete initiative.
Mm-hmm. And provide advice. Here are the 10 steps you need to carry this out, as opposed to sitting second seat and saying, okay, do this, do that.
Exactly right. Exactly right. You can't, as a matter of law, be put in a decision-making role when you're a consultant. And we were often, if we were doing a strategic plan, we would help facilitate the development of that by the agency.
What makes a good government client versus a bad government client?
What a great question. I think there's often a mistrust of contractors because we have goals to meet in terms of revenue, and so we are often thinking about what the next sale is. But uh, barring that as a barrier to a closer relationship, you want a smart client, one that knows what they're trying to accomplish, one that can distinguish between good and bad, and that can not only direct you but take advice. I can't tell you how many times we delivered beautiful products that went ignored. And I think the client should intend to use whatever product they're buying, because a lot of wasted money invested in consultants that produce advice that's not followed.
I asked you earlier what you wish, when you came to OMB, what you had learned that you wish you'd known when you were in Congress. Talk about when you came to the private sector. What did you learn in the private sector that you wish you had learned when you were still in government?
So I was in the House and the Senate and the White House, and I would say the gulf between my experience in those organizations and I learned having worked in agencies was enormous. I was surprised by how poorly managed agencies were, how under-resourced they were from a talent perspective. I think I also understood this barrier. The same is almost true. It's like knowing that I could go to the Hill at OMB. Agencies should not have such a strong fear of OMB. I was talking to a very, very senior executive at an agency that I worked with at OMB, who, when they were confronted with a budget challenge, said, well, let's just invite OMB folks over for lunch. And I'm like, well, we've never done that before. And she said, well, let's do it. And the organization fought her in this, because there's just some weird fear of OMB. And somewhat earned, but if you can overcome that fear, then I think you can begin to have a much more constructive relationship. But if I were a contractor who sort of leveraged my relationships at OMB, that's a major faux pas that I learned the hard way.
Tell me about post-government employment restrictions, and were you subject to those when you left? Or did they have an impact on your ability to find employment leaving government? Was that?
Well, I couldn't sell work to OMB for a period of time, which is fine because OMB doesn't buy anything. So it really wasn't that big of an impact. Didn't have that big of an impact on me.
Did it have an impact? I don't know whether you played a role in hiring at Grant Thornton. I assume you did. Did it have an impact on your ability to bring in talent?
No, not particularly. We were a relatively small organization, and OMB is an unusual place to draw from. So we did have a concerted effort to burnish our consulting staff with expertise in certain areas, either domain expertise or a specific agency expertise. Former senior government executives was a cadre we had in place, and we sort of ended up hiring who came to us. We didn't have a very sophisticated way of building that. Could have done a better job of that.
But you were able to find the former seniors that you needed. It wasn't that you found that the post-employment restrictions were an insuperable barrier to that or anything.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right.
Tell me about GovNavigators. What is GovNavigators? What does it do?
So in my job at Grant Thornton, I oversaw the strategy practice, the marketing and communications operation, and the governmental affairs function. So my colleague and I, my former deputy at Grant Thornton and I have put out our shingle to offer those services to other organizations. So we've got private sector, not-for-profit organizations who want to understand the landscape of the federal government, understand the policy evolution and how it's going to impact their operations.
This sounds different from just the normal lobbying practice.
It is not. It is. We do a small amount of public policy advocacy. It's mostly analysis, helping people hone their messages, make sure they're attuned to what emerging challenges are and how their services can be tailored to helping organizations address them.
Mm-hmm. And now tell me about NAPA. Tell me about how you came to I assume you've been a NAPA fellow for a while. If you assumed leadership positions, tell me how you came to NAPA, what kind of role you played there, and what about that organization.
So at the time, I was the youngest fellow ever elected. I think that's changed since then. I'm certainly older now. I learned about NAPA when in the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs staffer at the time, Hannah Sester, was a longtime fellow, as was her husband. And there was a meeting of Congressional and executive branch and others interested in management issues that would get together monthly for lunch, free lunch, a strong draw as a Senate staffer. And it was really a neat way to collaborate across those silos. So I had a warm feeling about NAPA, and when someone nominated me, I was really proud of that. So but then was recruited to the board, and not-for-profit leadership and governance is probably the subject of another show. NAPA's always been called the one organization in the world that's less than the sum of its parts, because it's got this really impressive cadre of fellows, you being among them. And it's hard to really leverage those as an asset for the organization and its target clientele. But it is, it does incredible studies and has enormous opportunity to contribute to improved public administration. I think a sweet spot it's got right now is better collaboration across federal, state, local, tribal governments. It's got some magic pieces going on right now that if they coalesce, if they can put those puzzles together, could really be a locus for an improved compact with states and other government.
So I've got one more question for you.
Yes, sir.
What advice would you have for individuals who are entering senior management positions in the government today?
I would encourage leaning heavily on their humility. There is great wisdom, and if you can tap into that, you've landed in your position because of your experience and expertise, but you don't have all that you need to be successful. So tap into the reservoirs of other expertise and experience that you need to be successful.
A perfect way to finish. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much.